Hello, my name is Delaney Shannon, and today I'll be talking about the Freedom Riders. Before we can jump into the timeline and the specific history of the Freedom Riders, we must first take a look at the Civil Rights Movement that spanned from 1954 to 1968. The movement was responsible for coming up with the idea that African Americans should have equal rights as white Americans. However, you cannot come to this conclusion or make a change without activist groups. This is where the Freedom Riders and many other groups began to come into play. Throughout the Civil Rights Movement, we see multiple different groups form, fighting for their rights and civility in American society. In this time period, one of the biggest issues was segregation. Segregation could tell you where you could sit, who you could eat with, and what kind of school you could go to. The Freedom Riders was one of these groups that tried to fight segregation. The Freedom Riders were organized by CORE in 1961, also known as Congregation of Racial Equality. It was one of the earliest civil rights activist groups created and was responsible for the Journey of Recollection that took place in 1947 before the Civil Rights Movement even officially began. The movement took place in regards to the decision in Morgan v. Virginia that found the segregation of buses and trains unconstitutional. However, there was no regulation that required states to follow this idea of it being unconstitutional. The purpose of the Journey of Recollection was to test these ideas, to test it and see what would happen if they tried to follow what the Supreme Court ruled. Several years later, we see a similar case arise, Boughton v. Virginia case. This case found that the segregation of public interstate transportation was unconstitutional. However, much like Morgan v. Virginia, there was no regulations regarding it. The core group saw this as the perfect opportunity to start a movement, much like they had several years ago, which led them to organize the Freedom Riders in 1961. And the person you see on the screen is James L. Farmer, who was one of the founders of the core group. On May 3rd of 1961, the 13 members of the Freedom Riders met in Washington, D.C. to discuss their plan and journey that would begin the very next day. Unlike the Journey of Recollection, the Freedom Riders integrated women into their group, which showed progression in its own way. The group planned on traveling through the southern states, also known as Jim Crow states, of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and lastly, Louisiana, also Mississippi as well. You can see up on the map as well, their starting point and their destination ending point. Their hope was to make it to New Orleans by May 17th in time to celebrate the 7-year anniversary of the Brown v. Board case, which was responsible for the desegregation of school system. It is clear that the group knew the journey ahead of them would not be easy. The journey began in Virginia the very next day. Well, they departed from Washington, D.C., but the first state they entered was Virginia. There was very little hostility in Virginia, most likely because the press did not know that they were coming. None of the members endured any violence, and their journey was rather peaceful. The next state they headed into after Virginia was North Carolina. This was fairly peaceful as well. However, one member of the Freedom Riders was affected when he attempted to get his shoes shined at a white-only shop and was thrown in jail. He refused to get his bail posted and was required to spend 2 nights in jail. On May 10th, he was released after having a hearing in front of the judge. Both Virginia and North Carolina were considerably peaceful states compared to what they would endure as the trip continued on. And in the picture, this is a picture taken of 2 of the Freedom Riders when they first began entering Virginia. And this was one of the only pictures in the press at the time. On May 10th of 1961, the Freedom Riders arrived in South Carolina. They stopped in a small city known as Rock Hill, where a few of the members decided to test the segregation of the white-only restrooms at the bus terminal. As you can see, I put a picture on the slide so you could get a good idea of what they look like. This made a lot of the white men unhappy, which led to an outbreak of violence and a fight. One of the perpetrators was Ellen Wilson, who was a known member of the Ku Klux Klan at the time. However, suspiciously, the cops did not show up after a long time to break up the fight and allowed Wilson and his comrades to injure the three of the members of the Freedom Riders, John Lewis, Al Bigelow, and Geneva Hughes. Even after the violence they had just endured, they still wanted to continue on. After South Carolina, the Freedom Riders arrived in Atlanta, Georgia, on May 13th. Their visit was quite pleasant, and they had no violent encounters. While it may be considered uneventful like North Carolina and Virginia, there was one event that set them apart from the other states. This was meeting up with Martin Luther King Jr. The group decided to meet up with him and discuss their journey thus far and what their next destination would hold. The Freedom Riders tried to convince King to join them as well. However, he denied and tried to get them to see just how unwise it was to continue. Their next stop would be Alabama, which was notorious for being the most segregated state in the country. King warned them that he had heard of welcoming committees that would be waiting for them when they arrived and urged them to reconsider their decision to go. The group respectfully thanked King for his information but decided that they could not quit now and must continue their journey. They did, however, decide to get another bus to split the members in half, and half would be traveling on the Greyhound and another half on the Trailway. The first bus to make it to Alabama was the Greyhound. It arrived in Anniston and was met with an angry mob of people. The bus was eventually escorted about 5 miles out of town by a local police officer. The bus had to stop because their tire popped, and after that event occurred, the police officer decided to leave them alone with the angry mob. The group was eventually forced to leave the bus when one of the attackers threw a bomb into it. At one point, the mob was even seen trying to force the door shut so that the Freedom Riders could not escape and burn when the bus caught on fire. There's a picture of the bus on the screen. As you can see, it was brutally bad, and the flames were horrific. Eventually, the explosion of one of the fuel tanks scared some of the attackers away, allowing the Freedom Riders to escape. However, even when they escaped, they were still met with an angry mob of people that beat them recklessly and did not hold back. This is the next bus. The Trailblazer bus arrived after the Greyhound at a different stop in Anniston, Alabama. None of them had heard of what their fellow group had just endured, and they themselves were greeted with multiple members of the Ku Klux Klan who boarded the bus and brutally beat them and forced them to sit in the back where they belong. The Klan members refused to leave the bus until they arrived at the destination in Birmingham and were repeatedly yelling racial slurs and freedom at the Freedom Riders, promising them a special reception when they arrived. I cannot find an original picture of the bus, however, this is a very close replica of the one they used. On May 14th, Mother's Day, the Trailway bus made it to Birmingham, Alabama, and was greeted with mobs, like more than ever before, of the local KKK members who had struck a deal with police officers, allowing them 15 minutes to install whatever violence they wanted without them facing any charges. Two of the Freedom Riders, Charles Pewson and Jim Peck, attempted to continue testing the segregation of lunch counters and restrooms, and were shut down as soon as they did it. Peck sustained the worst injuries when he was repeatedly beaten with a baseball bat. As you can see, this is a picture of him after the attack, and you can see how rough condition he is in. And none of the hospitals wanted to give him help due to the reputation. He eventually found one willing to help him, and he received 53 stitches in his head. After this event, the Freedom Riders tried to continue to Montgomery, Alabama. However, they had trouble trying to recruit someone to drive them the rest of the way. Robert Kennedy was responsible for trying to protect the Freedom Riders in Alabama. However, he was unsuccessful, and it was eventually decided the only option the Freedom Riders had was to fly to Louisiana, or to fly to Louisiana and then New Orleans. However, even upon their arrival to the airport, the Freedom Riders were met with mobs of people trying to violently assault them. Once they arrived in New Orleans, they were provided with state troopers who were doing the opposite of protecting them throughout the trip to the terminal. The Freedom Riders were eventually successful to making their Brown v. Board concert, and definitely drew the media attention that they were hoping for. And this is a map of Louisiana, and as you can see, they stopped in Birmingham, Alabama, which is quite a distance from the original destination, but either way, the message was still clear. May 24th, days after the Freedom Riders had endured the violence in Anniston, a group of new Freedom Riders departed from Montgomery Transit in an attempt to finish the original Freedom Ride. They endured violence, but also had hundreds of supporters there to cheer them on as they continued their ride. However, their ride came to an end, and they were not successful in continuing the original Freedom Riders ride when they tried to enter a white-only restroom and were arrested. There's a picture of the mugshot on the screen. As you can see, there's several of them. And throughout the summer, we continued to see several more groups travel on interstate buses to gather the attention and demand desegregation of bus system. Finally, in fall of 1961, the Kennedy administration was forced to issue regulations that would prohibit segregation at interstate bus terminals and violence, since there was so much violence and it could no longer be tolerated. Did their movement lead to a change? This is an interesting question. At the beginning of the presentation, we talked about how activist groups played a big role in the civil rights movement, and this was definitely one of them. They were single-handedly responsible for desegregating interstate transit. This was a big deal since the group was so successful in doing so. As we move forward in history, we see zero segregation in public facilities, which we not only have other civil rights activist groups to thank, but also the Freedom Riders, since they were also helpful in creating this. So here's some of the citations I used. And for the JSTOR ones, I highlighted them so they were easier to find. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I'll try to answer as many as I can. I hope this was helpful and informative and gave you a better idea of what the Freedom Riders did and how it was so important to our history.